Hello, this is Grandmaster Bryan Smith with ChessLessons.com. In this four-part series, I'm going to be showing games from a tournament that I actually played for the first time since the COVID crisis began, other than one rapid tournament, which I played last summer. So this was not a really big tournament, but at least I was playing chess over the board, something that a lot of people haven't got a chance to do during this time, and which I missed a lot. I missed very much. So I'm covering the games from this tournament, and well, it was lower-rated players, but still we can learn a lot from the games, I hope. First round game was against a player rated, I believe, in the 1700s, high 1700s, close to 1800. My opponent's name was Yerajanu. Sirisa. This was a young lady. She began with the move e4, and for the first tournament game back to chess, I decided to play the French defense. She continued with d4, d5, and now e takes d5. So the exchange variation, not the most ambitious variation against the French, but reasonable. It's not a variation that I've worried about as black ever. I don't worry about its supposed drawish nature, because it doesn't really seem to turn out very drawish in reality. There are a lot of ways for black to create asymmetrical positions despite the early exchange. Now my opponent played knight c3. More common is bishop d3, but she preferred this move. And I played knight f6. Now came first kind of surprising move, bishop f4. I don't think this move is particularly good. I think white should, the bishop move doesn't make a lot of sense. White should concentrate on developing the king side. The bishop might go to g5 later, but immediately developing like this is not the most accurate. So bishop d3, followed by knight to e2, or perhaps queen f3 even in some cases, and then knight to e2. This is a more typical way of playing. She played bishop f4, and I decided now to pin the knight with bishop b4. I hadn't chosen this move on the previous move, which would have transposed to a Winover variation. But now, after bishop f4, I thought it was a good idea to pin the knight on c3. And in fact, this provoked another very strange move, knight g to e2. This is a little bit too cumbersome and a little bit too convoluted. White is blocking the bishop on f1, so this delays white's development, and this is something you really can't do in an open game like this. She's too concerned maybe that I would take on c3 and double the pawns, but that really wouldn't be what I would do. Bishop d3 would be better, and there's no reason to worry about me taking on c3. In fact, normally black won't take in such a situation without the move a3 provoking it. The two bishops would be worth more, and white could dissolve the doubled pawns later by playing c4. So black would feel a weakness of the dark square. So I wouldn't have taken on c3. I probably would have just castled kingside and continued in that way with bishop g4, then following and maybe c5 later on, going for some kind of isolated queen pawn position with active play for black. But she played knight to e2, so castles, and now a3. This is the point of her move. Now if I take on c3, she doesn't get doubled pawns, but of course I don't have to take on c3. The choice was to retreat the bishop to e7 or to go to a5 and maintain the pin, and I preferred to go bishop a5, which I think was the right choice. The bishop gets driven back to b6, but the b4 move weakens white's position still further. And on b6, the bishop is not really marooned so much. In fact, it has some pressure on the d4 pawn. So bishop a5, I think, was better than bishop e7. White played b4. Otherwise, she could develop with maybe g3 or something, but this was the logical follow-up. b4, bishop b6, and I expected the move knight a4, which again seemed consistent. White wants to maybe lock the bishop out with c3 for one thing, to reduce the pressure on d4, maybe exchange it at some point. I didn't think knight a4 was necessarily that good of a move, but I expected it, but that's not what she played. In any case, after knight a4, I was probably going to play just knight c6. And this makes it hard for white to develop the knight, to move the knight from e2, because d4 pawn is hanging. If white ends up just exchanging on b6, then black gets the open a file. And this is more relevant than the two bishops here. And this bishop will come to a nice square f5, rook will come to the e file, and white is under great pressure. She wouldn't have to exchange, but still it's difficult to develop her pieces. Then c3 could be played, but then rook e8 continues to create problems for white, with bishop coming out and knight e4 at some moment. So this is not easy for white. So she instead played queen to d2, which was another inaccuracy. The queen doesn't do anything on d2, and it's just exposed in addition to losing a tempo. The best chance was to play g3 and develop the bishop to g2 and at least get castled, but black's game is very comfortable here. White has some weaknesses, and black develops his pieces very easily. So instead queen to d2 was played. Now I took the opportunity with a5 to open the a file, and white decided to play rook b1. I think maybe it was better to play b5, but in these kinds of positions, often people don't want to play this move because now, well, for one thing, I could play a4, and now the bishop might come to a5, and basically now I also can play c5, so she doesn't have the same kind of hold on the queen side, keeping the position closed. So she played rook b1, keeping me from being able to push my c-pawn and open the game. But now I get the a file as well, which is an additional advantage. Capture on b4, and now bishop f5. I'm a little bit surprised, actually, I use this move order. It looks maybe a little bit more accurate to play knight c6, which would avoid allowing white to move the knight from e2 at all, and pretty much keep white from developing. And if b5 in these positions, then the knight comes even into a worse square for white, c4. So that's pretty much unthinkable for white. So knight c6 would have been good, but my move was also okay. I played bishop f5, putting some pressure on c2 and developing the bishop, and here white played f3, trying to keep me from, I guess, invading on e4, which wasn't really my plan, and maybe she clearly wanted to expand on the king side, but I think this is very over-optimistic. It's hard to give advice, though, for white. Knight g3 might have been the more practical choice, but the problem was that now knight c6 is going to attack the d-pawn, and it's not going to be easy at all for white to defend it. For instance, if bishop e2, knight c6, and the pawn is already very hard to defend. She can defend it with bishop e3, but then black can add pressure with moves like queen e7 attacking b4, and more problems with those kinds of things. And if, for instance, queen e7, this attacks b4, white really can't allow, again, the knight into a5 and then c4. But if white's knight moves from c3, then rook to a2 would then create new threats. So really black's initiative is quite hard to quell here. She could try after bishop g6, she could try bishop d3, but then, for instance, rook e8, knight c2, knight c6, and again, still very unpleasant position for white. Black's pieces are more active, and white has weaknesses. Black has the a file, and just excellent position for black. Instead, white played f3. I played knight c6. Now, really, it's hard for white to do anything because d4 pawn is under attack and her pieces are tied to it, and white can't even move the knight from c3 to try to somehow play c3, which would also be impossible because the pawn is pinned. But also, then even if the knight moves from c3, then rook a2. Knight can't move from e2. Bishop e3 is just black's going to build up with rook e8 and queen e7. So it's hard to find any moves for white. So it's understandable that white started to press with g4 on the king side, at least get some kind of chances. So I played bishop g6, and now h4, the logical follow-up. Again, nothing else really to recommend here. And I didn't need to stop this pawn right away because I could first insert the move rook e8, which is what I played. And it's just a little tactic. If white continues ahead with h5, then knight takes d4 would threaten the fork on f3. And white's knight is, of course, pinned, so the black knight can't be captured. And black is also threatening to take on c2, so this bishop won't be trapped. The white position is lost now. So instead she had to defend the d-pawn, so she played king to d1. The other move was king to f2, which is no better because then the king would be in the line of fire of the bishop on b6. Of course, king on d1 now, well, the king was never going to find safety at this point, but it's not too happy on d1 either. So now I have to meet the threat of h5, so I played h5 myself. And she played bishop h3, defending the pawn. I'm threatening the pawn. In these cases, sometimes white looks like they're attacking on the king's side, but often this h5 move actually shows that sometimes you can turn the tables and turn out that black is probing at the weaknesses. So that's what happened here. White could play g5, but after knight h7, I thought white's position is just lost because there's no moves for white. The d4 pawn again has to be defended. The knight can't move from c3 because of rook a2. And bishop e3 will not be a long-term defense because of queen e7, threatening a bishop and also the b4 pawn. And meanwhile, black is simply bringing the knight back into the game to e6, and white will no longer have enough pieces to defend d4. So it takes a couple moves, but there's nothing white can do in the meantime. So seeing that, she played bishop h3, trying to get some chances, but this allows me now the access to the e4 square. So I took on g4. She took with the bishop, which was not positionally the move you typically see, but probably the best chance, because if white took with a pawn, then I would simply play knight e4 right away, hitting the queen. White would have to take it, and then after bishop takes, I would attack the rook. On h1, I would also be opening up an attack on the pawn with my queen on h4, and additionally I have rook a2, which would attack the c-pawn, which is now, this move is now possible because the knight's gone from c3. So she took with the bishop, and I decided to take the bishop, removing the defender of the light squares. She took, and now queen to d7. So a useful tempo, connecting the rooks and attacking the pawn on g4. If white goes h5, I would play bishop e4, just like I ended up playing in the game. The pawn is under attack on g4. White really has to guard it, so she played rook g1. And now I played bishop e4 anyway. So I'm allowing the exchange of this bishop, but my pieces now come in on the e-file. I gain control of the e-file. She took the bishop. The threat was bishop to f3, so she really kind of had to. Bishop f3 was going to pin the knight and attack the g-pawn, and then white would also be threatened by knight takes d4 afterwards. I thought she might play rook to g3 to stop that move, which was really the only way to stop it, but then, for instance, queen e7 would attack the pawn on b4 and the pawn on h4. And if white now tried taking the bishop on e4, then the queen would take, and here I would be threatening to come in on h1 and then still take the pawn. I'd also be threatening the pawn on d4, so there's no defense for white here. Position is just falling apart. White has weaknesses everywhere, and the king is in the middle. The pieces are uncoordinated. So she took the bishop, and of course rook takes. I don't need a passed pawn. D takes c4 would close the position down too much. Rook takes instead now creates the threat to the pawn on d4. So she had to guard it with c3. And then came the other rook, rook a to e8. Well, I'm leaving the a file, but I can achieve more in this position on the e file. So here she played knight c1, after which everything is very simple. The best defense was rook to g2. Of course, she can't move the knight to g3 because I would take the pawn on g4 then, because it's not guarded anymore. Let's check. So rook to g2 was the better defense, but then black has many moves. For instance, I thought about queen e7, or queen e6 rather, which leaves white with no moves at all. The knight can't move from from e2 because of rook e1 check, or knight takes d4, depending on what white does, or queen takes g4 if the knight goes to g3. The bishop can't achieve anything. The queen and rook and king are all tied to the knight on e4, and meanwhile, this knight will just make a progress coming in with knight a7 to b5. This is one way to play, or I also thought I might just play knight a7 immediately, which is also easily winning. Black's queen might come to a4, but most importantly, the knight's coming to b5, and this is just going to overload white's position. There's no way to defend. The knight can't move from e2. White can't move the pieces at all, and every one of her pieces are just stuck here. So that was easily winning for black. Instead, she played knight c1, and now came the sacrifice knight takes d4. Of course, black breaks through in this way. White has to take the knight. Rook takes d4, pinning the queen to the king. Knight to d3. Now there's no need for rook takes d3, which of course is winning for black up 2 pawns. Rook takes d3 followed by taking on g1. But instead it was better to just continue the attack with queen a4. With a forcing continuation, she played king c1. If queen c2, then the queen is pinned, so rook takes d3 would win everything. Win back the piece, and also the bishop is attacking the rook on g1 now. So she played king c1, rook c4, king b2, and now bishop d4. So black's still down a piece, so it's kind of a real sacrifice, at least for the moment, but pieces are swarming in on the white king, and in fact the only legal move is queen c3, which she played. Some people would resign here, but my opponent decided to play until checkmate. I checked on e2. If king c1, then rook takes c3 is checkmate, so she played bishop d2. Bishop takes c3. King b1, and now it's mate in 2. I decided to go with bishop b2. Bishop d2 is the same thing. The only move is to take the bishop because it's double check, and now rook c2 is checkmate. So I hope you found this game instructive. Stay tuned for part 2 from this tournament in the St. Petersburg Chess Club in St. Petersburg, Florida. This has been Grandmaster Bryan Smith with ChessLessons.com.